The Commonwealth of Virginia, in the year 1834, was a place of profound contradiction. It was the birthplace of American presidents, a land of rolling bluegrass hills and genteel plantation society. Yet it was also a state whose economy and social order were built upon the brutal foundation of chattel slavery. This duality, the polished surface of civility masking a core of horrific violence, was not confined to the fields and slave quarters. It could fester in plain sight, hidden behind the whitewashed walls of a respectable family home. Such was the case with the Sullivan family of Halifax County, a household that would become synonymous with one of the most chilling and enigmatic crimes in American history. The Sullivans were, by all outward appearances, the embodiment of Virginia's rural aristocracy. The patriarch, Alastair Sullivan, was a man in his late 50s, known for his sharp business acumen and vast land holdings. He was a respected figure in the county, a church deacon, and a man whose word carried weight in local politics. His wife, Beatrice, was a decade younger, a delicate woman who was a fixture at church socials and known for her elaborate embroidery and quiet, pious demeanor. They had 3 grown children who had moved away to start families of their own, leaving Alastair and Beatrice alone in their large, columned estate, Willow Creek, a testament to their success and standing. The estate itself was a picture of bucolic prosperity. Situated on over 500 acres of prime farmland, it featured a grand 2-story federal-style manor house, immaculate stables, and thriving fields worked by nearly 100 enslaved Africans. To their neighbors and the wider community of Halifax County, the Sullivans were a model of stability and grace. They were not merely accepted, they were admired. This impeccable reputation was the first layer of a formidable facade, a wall behind which unspeakable secrets could grow undisturbed for decades. The first cracks in this facade were not dramatic, but they were persistent. Travelers on the road past Willow Creek would sometimes mention a strange detail. They rarely saw children on the property. This was unusual for a plantation of its size, where the enslaved community typically included many children. When questioned, Alastair Sullivan would offer a smooth, plausible explanation. He would speak of a fever that had swept through the quarters some years back, sadly claiming the lives of the young and the weak. He spoke of his Christian charity and funding a small schoolhouse for the children of his most trusted foreman, located on a distant part of the property, away from the distractions of the main house. His tone was so laced with sorrow and benevolence that it quelled further inquiry. Other whispers were even quieter. A new housemaid, a young enslaved woman named Cora, mentioned to the cook that the cellar door in the main house was always kept locked with a heavy iron bolt, a peculiarity she found odd in a house with such ample storage. The cook, an older woman named Mama June, had simply shaken her head and warned Cora to mind her place and never, ever ask about the cellar. There was a fear in her eyes that silenced further questions. Occasionally, delivery men would comment on the strange, almost imperceptible humming sound that seemed to emanate from the ground beneath the house, which Alastair dismissed as the water table shifting through limestone caverns, a known geological feature in the area. The most significant clue, one that would later haunt the community with its implications, was the behavior of the Sullivans' enslaved laborers. Unlike on other plantations, where there might be singing in the fields or quiet conversation in the evenings, a pervasive silence hung over Willow Creek. The enslaved men and women moved with a singular, grim purpose, their eyes perpetually downcast. They showed a uniform, terrified reluctance to interact with outsiders, even with preachers who visited to minister to them. They were, as one visitor later described, a community of ghosts. their spirits seemingly broken beyond even the horrific norm of the institution that bound them. The silence was enforced by the Sullivans' overseer, a hulking, cruel man named Jedediah Crow. Where Alistar was the polished public face of authority, Crow was its brutal instrument. He was known for his vicious temper and his fanatical loyalty to the Sullivans. It was understood among the enslaved population that any infraction, any hint of dissent, or any attempt to communicate with the outside world would be met with swift and terrible punishment from Crow. His presence was a constant reminder that the beauty of Willow Creek was a prison, and its order was maintained by a reign of terror. For nearly 30 years, this system held firm. The Sullivans' wealth grew, their reputation remained untarnished, and the strange absence of children and a locked cellar door were dismissed as eccentricities of a wealthy, perhaps slightly odd family. The community's desire to believe in the Sullivans' reputation was a more effective prison wall than any iron bolt. No one looked too closely. No one asked the right questions. The darkness at the heart of Willow Creek festered and grew, completely invisible to the world outside, waiting for a single catastrophic event to tear the carefully constructed facade completely away. The history of American crime is filled with shadows, but some are darker than others. The story of the Sullivan family is a descent into a horror that was hidden in plain sight. To follow the investigation that shattered a community's trust and revealed a nightmare, you must subscribe to the channel. The truth is more terrifying than fiction. Hit the bell so you don't miss a moment. The event that shattered the 30 years' silence at Willow Creek was not a heroic investigation or a slave's brave escape. It was an act of God. In the late summer of 1834, a series of powerful thunderstorms rolled across Halifax County. For 3 days, the skies unleashed torrential rains, turning roads into rivers and fields into quagmires. On the night of September 12th, a particularly violent storm cell settled directly over the Sullivan estate. The downpour was apocalyptic, and the winds howled like a vengeful spirit. It was this ferocious wind that proved to be the catalyst. A massive ancient oak tree, its roots weakened by the saturated ground, were struck by a blinding fork of lightning. With a deafening crack that echoed over the roar of the storm, the tree split and crashed directly onto the roof of the Sullivan Manor. The impact was catastrophic. The tree smashed through the upper floor, and the accompanying lightning strike sent an electrical charge through the house that instantly ignited the old, dry timber in the walls. The resulting fire was swift and devastating. The combination of the structural damage and the raging storm made efforts to combat the flames nearly impossible. Alistair and Beatrice Sullivan, along with their house servants, were forced to flee the burning mansion into the torrential rain, watching helplessly as their home and all their worldly possessions were consumed by the infernal. The enslaved community from the quarters, under the frantic direction of Jedediah Crow, formed a bucket brigade from the well, but their efforts were a futile gesture against the storm-fueled blaze. As the fire raged, a new sound began to rise above the din of the storm and the crackle of flames. It started as a low collective moan, barely audible at first. But as the fire spread to the foundation and the cellar level, the sound grew in intensity and clarity. It was not the sound of burning wood. It was the sound of human voices, dozens of them, screaming in utter terror. The bucket brigade froze. The Sullivans, standing soaked and shivering in their nightclothes, turned ashen. The screams were coming from underground, from the cellar. Alistair Sullivan stared in horror, not at the burning house, but at the ground. He began shouting incoherently,
Not orders to fight the fire, but desperate, panic commands to Jedediah Crow. "The door! Secure the door!" he screamed, his respectable veneer vaporized by primal fear. But it was too late. The fire had done its work. The intense heat had weakened the heavy iron bolt on the cellar door, and the burning frame around it was giving way. As the enslaved workers and the Sullivans watched, the cellar door, now glowing with heat, burst open from the inside. The sight that emerged from the billowing smoke and steam would be seared into the memory of every witness, a vision from hell itself.
Figures began to stumble out into the storm, but these were not figures anyone recognized. They were children. Dozens upon dozens of children, ranging in age from toddlers to young teenagers. They were emaciated, filthy, and dressed in little more than rags. Many were coughing, their lungs filled with smoke. But the most horrifying detail, the detail that made several witnesses vomit into the mud, was the chains. Each child was shackled at the ankle. A long, heavy chain linked them together in a monstrous human chain gang. Their ankles were raw and bleeding from years of chafing against the iron. They blinked against the rain and the terrifying light of the fire that had freed them, their screams now turning into wails of confusion and pain. They had been released from their underground prison, only to be confronted with a world on fire. The enslaved workers, recovering from their shock, rushed forward not to fight the flames, but to help the children. They used their bare hands and tools to break the chains, their own horror eclipsed by a surge of protective compassion. In the chaotic scene, Alistair Sullivan seemed to shrink into himself, his face a mask of utter ruin. Beatrice Sullivan fainted dead away into the mud. Jedediah Crow drew a pistol, his eyes wild, but he was quickly overwhelmed and disarmed by a group of larger enslaved men who had seen enough. The social order of Willow Creek had been inverted in a single fiery instant. The storm eventually passed, and the fire burned itself out, leaving only the smoldering ruins of the great house. As dawn broke on September 13th, the full, staggering scale of the discovery became clear. The enslaved community, now acting with a newfound and desperate agency, had gathered the children, all 47 of them, in the relative shelter of the barn. They had brought food, water, and blankets. A count was taken. 47 children. All showed signs of severe, prolonged malnutrition and neglect. None could speak clearly. Their utterances were limited to guttural sounds and whimpers. They recoiled from touch and from sunlight. A rider was finally sent to the county seat. He did not go to the Sullivan's associates. He went directly to the sheriff, a man named Josiah Phelps. The message was simple and staggering. You need to come to Willow Creek. There are children in chains. There are 47 of them. The world was about to crash down upon the house of Sullivan. The fire exposed a secret that defied all understanding. But who were these children? Why were they imprisoned? The investigation is just beginning, and the answers will shake Virginia to its core. To follow the forensic and legal struggle to uncover the truth, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for the next chapter.
The arrival of Sheriff Josiah Phelps and his deputies at Willow Creek that September morning marked the beginning of an investigation so bizarre and horrifying that it would challenge the legal and social conventions of the era. The initial scene was one of surreal chaos. The blackened, smoking ruins of the manor house, a group of terrified, chained children huddled in a barn, the esteemed Alistair Sullivan and his wife under effective house arrest in the overseer's cabin, and the entire enslaved population of the plantation standing in a silent, accusatory vigil. Sheriff Phelps, a pragmatic and decent man, was utterly out of his depth. Nothing in his experience as a lawman had prepared him for this. His first act was to secure the scene and the children. Blacksmiths from the county seat were summoned to carefully remove the shackles from the children's ankles, a painstaking and heart-rending process. Local physicians were called to examine them. Their findings were consistent and devastating. All 47 children suffered from severe malnutrition, vitamin deficiencies, and stunted growth. Many had old fractures that had healed poorly without medical attention. Most chillingly, the doctors concluded that based on their physical development and the state of their confinement, many of these children had likely been in the cellar for most, if not all, of their lives. The question on everyone's lips was, who were these children? They were clearly not the missing children of the plantation's enslaved workers. Those families were accounted for, and these children were overwhelmingly white, with fair hair and light eyes. Their parentage was a profound mystery. Alistair and Beatrice Sullivan, now isolated and facing ruin, refused to speak. They invoked their right to legal counsel and retreated into a stony, impenetrable silence. Jedediah Crow, the overseer, was thrown in the county jail, but he too refused to talk, snarling threats and curses at his interrogators. The break in the case came from an unexpected source, the enslaved population of Willow Creek. With the Sullivans' power broken and protected by the sheriff's presence, their wall of silence finally crumbled. Led by the elderly cook, Mama June, they began to whisper their stories to the investigators. Over days of careful, respectful testimony, a monstrous 30-year conspiracy began to unfold. The children, they revealed, were indeed the biological children of Alistair and Beatrice Sullivan. This was the darkest secret of all. Over 3 decades, Beatrice Sullivan had given birth to a child almost every year, but these were not the heirs she and Alistair wanted. Each child was born with a visible deformity or condition that the perfection-obsessed Sullivans deemed unacceptable. A cleft lip, a clubfoot, a port wine stain, or what we would now recognize as Down syndrome. In a time of immense social stigma and a complete lack of medical understanding, the Sullivans saw these children not as their offspring, but monstrous embarrassments, living blasphemies against their own image of genetic purity and social standing. Their solution was unspeakable. Instead of sending them to an asylum or quietly arranging for their care elsewhere, they devised a system of perpetual imprisonment. Each child was taken from its mother at birth and secreted away into the specially modified cellar. The cellar was not a dungeon in the traditional sense. It had been outfitted with small cots, a sanitation system, and was soundproofed to contain the noise. The children were fed a meager slop to keep them alive, but they were never allowed to see the light of day, never educated, never spoken to with kindness. They were raised in a silent, dark world known only to the Sullivans and their most terrified, complicit servants. Jedediah Crow's primary role was not overseeing the fields, it was being the jailer of this secret nursery of the damned. The enslaved workers were forced into this horror. Selected individuals were made to cook the food and dispose of the waste under threat of brutal punishment to themselves and their families if they ever spoke a word. This explained the pervasive silence and fear on the plantation. They had been made unwilling accomplices to a crime of unimaginable cruelty happening literally beneath their feet. The purpose of the children's existence, beyond simply being hidden, was even more grotesque. As they grew older and stronger, they were put to work. The strange humming sound heard by delivery men was real. The Sullivan fortune had not been built on tobacco alone. The cellar contained a clandestine workshop
where the children, chained to their stations, were forced to assemble intricate pieces of furniture and craft small luxury goods, wooden toys, embroidered linens, fine leather goods, which Alistair Sullivan sold through a discreet network of merchants in Richmond and even northern cities. The children were not just a hidden shame, they were a secret slave labor force, their deformities making them impossible to ever show in public, thus ensuring their perpetual imprisonment.
The revelation sent shockwaves through Virginia and across the nation. The story was picked up by newspapers from Boston to New Orleans. The Sullivan case became a sensation, a gothic horror story made real. It was a story that held a dark mirror up to the nation, confronting it with the extremes of vanity, cruelty, and the monstrous things people could do to protect their reputation. The truth was more horror than anyone could have imagined. But the legal battle was just beginning. How does a court try a crime this unprecedented? The world was watching as Virginia prepared for a trial that would define justice itself. To follow the courtroom drama and the fight for the children's future, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for the next installment. The trial of Alistair and Beatrice Sullivan, which began in the Halifax County Courthouse in the spring of 1835, was a spectacle unlike any the young United States had ever witnessed. The rustic courtroom was packed with reporters, sketch artists, and horrified citizens who had traveled from across the state to catch a glimpse of the monsters who had perpetrated such an atrocity. The air was thick with a palpable mixture of morbid curiosity and boiling outrage. The legal challenges were immense. The Sullivans, now represented by a shrewd and expensive lawyer from Richmond, argued that no specific law in the Virginia Code explicitly forbade a man from imprisoning his own children on his own property. This was a defense built on a grotesque technicality, but it highlighted the unprecedented nature of the crime. The prosecution, led by a fiercely determined state attorney named Benjamin Carter, had to build a case from the ground up, charging the Sullivans and Jedediah Crow with a litany of counts including assault, false imprisonment, kidnapping, and most significantly, cruelty to children. A charge that was itself a novel legal concept at the time. The heart of the prosecution's case was the testimony of the enslaved workers. One by one, they took the stand, their voices quiet but firm under the stern and respectful questioning of Attorney Carter. Mama June, the cook, described in heartbreaking detail the meager meals she was forced to prepare for the children, thin gruel and stale bread. A stable hand named Elijah testified to helping soundproof the cellar and described the hollow, hopeless sounds that sometimes escaped. But the most damning testimony came from Cora, the young housemaid who had first noticed the locked cellar door. She described being ordered by Jedediah Crow to deliver food down into the cellar one day when the usual servant was ill. She spoke of the cold, damp air, the sight of the pale, silent children chained to their cots, and the overwhelming smell of human waste and despair. Her description of one small girl who reached out a trembling hand to touch the fabric of her dress left not a single dry eye in the courtroom. The medical testimony was equally powerful. Doctors explained the severe and irreversible physical and developmental damage done to the children. They spoke of rickets from lack of sunlight, intellectual stunting from a complete lack of stimulation, and the profound psychological trauma that would likely haunt them for the rest of their lives. They were, in the words of one doctor, human beings who had been denied every single ingredient of humanity.
The defense's strategy was to paint the Sullivans as victims of their own time and circumstances, a product of an era that deeply feared and stigmatized deformity. They claimed the children were cared for to the best of the Sullivans' ability, and that the workshop was a form of occupational therapy. It was a cynical, desperate argument that rang hollow in the face of the emaciated, chain-scarred children who were, thankfully, kept away from the courtroom. The turning point came with the testimony of Jedediah Crow. Facing the gallows himself and offered a deal for a reduced sentence, Crow finally broke. In a flat, emotionless monotone, he corroborated the entire story. He described Alastair Sullivan's cold, clinical orders, Beatrice's detached indifference, and his own role in enforcing the silence of the plantation. He provided ledgers hidden in his own cabin that detailed the profits from the sale of the goods produced by the children. The defense's case collapsed utterly.
The jury was out for less than 2 hours. The verdicts were guilty on all counts for all 3 defendants. The judge, his voice trembling with a mixture of fury and sorrow, passed sentence. Jedediah Crow was sentenced to hang for his role as the chief enforcer of the tyranny. Alastair and Beatrice Sullivan were sentenced to life imprisonment in the state penitentiary. They were led away, their Gentile facade finally and forever stripped away, revealed as the hollow, monstrous shells they had always been. The trial was over, but the story was not. The fate of the 47 children remained. They were the living evidence of the Sullivans' crime, and now they were wards of the state of Virginia, a state that had no infrastructure to care for them. They represented a profound and unanswered question at the heart of the American experiment. What is our duty to the most vulnerable among us? The monsters were behind bars, but their victims remained. The story of the Sullivan children is one of resilience and the long and difficult road to recovery. What became of the 47? Their journey is the final, crucial chapter of this American tragedy. To learn their fate and the legacy of Willow Creek, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for the conclusion. With the Sullivans and Crow sentenced, the Commonwealth of Virginia was left with a moral and logistical crisis. What to do with the 47 children of Willow Creek? They were not simply orphans. They were survivors of a uniquely devastating form of trauma. They could not speak English in any coherent way, could not read or write, had no understanding of social norms, and were physically and psychologically shattered. They were, in the most literal sense, strangers to the world. Initial attempts to place them in county almshouses or with willing families were disastrous. The children, terrified of open spaces and unfamiliar people, would panic, retreat into corners, and often become ill. Their specific needs were far beyond the capacity of well-meaning but unprepared foster parents or the squalid conditions of public poorhouses. The public, initially full of sympathetic outrage, soon found the reality of caring for these broken individuals to be a difficult and unsettling responsibility. A solution was proposed by a group of Quaker abolitionists and social reformers from Philadelphia who had followed the trial with horror. They argued that the children needed specialized, dedicated care in an environment built for their rehabilitation. They petitioned the Virginia legislature to release the children into their custody, offering to transport them to Pennsylvania and establish a private sanctuary for their care, funded by charitable donations from across the North. The debate in the Virginia legislature was fierce. Many lawmakers were deeply reluctant to hand over 47 white Virginia children to Northern abolitionists, a move they saw as a political embarrassment and a slight on Southern honor. Others argued it was the only humane option, as the state had already failed them already.
Ultimately, pragmatism and shame won out. Facing the immense cost of lifelong care and the potential for continued scandal, the legislature agreed to the Quakers' proposal on the condition that regular reports on the children's welfare be sent back to Richmond. In the autumn of 1835, the 47 children, accompanied by a team of Quaker nurses and doctors, began their journey north. Newspapers dubbed it the Children's Exodus. The public followed their progress with intense interest. The children arrived at their new home, a repurposed farm outside of Philadelphia, which was christened Hope Haven. The first years at Hope Haven were incredibly difficult. The staff, though compassionate and dedicated, were pioneers in a field that did not yet exist: trauma rehabilitation. They worked tirelessly to teach the children language, to help them overcome their fear of sunlight and open spaces, and to treat their numerous medical ailments. Progress was agonizingly slow. Some children, particularly the younger ones, adapted better, slowly learning to trust and even to smile. Others, too deeply damaged by their years of sensory deprivation and abuse, never truly emerged from their shells. They lived out their days in a state of quiet, internal withdrawal.
The fate of the children varied greatly. Several of the more adaptable ones were eventually adopted by kind Quaker families and assimilated into society, their tragic origins a closely guarded secret. Others remained at Hope Haven for the rest of their lives, cared for by the institution that had become their true home. A number succumbed to illnesses related to their long neglect within a few years of their rescue, their bodies too weakened to recover. As for the site of the horror, Willow Creek Plantation was seized by the state of Virginia and sold at auction. The land was broken up, and the ruins of the manor house were bulldozed and plowed under. It was as if the state was trying to erase the memory of what had happened there. For decades afterwards, the property was considered haunted, and locals would avoid the area, claiming they could still hear the faint sound of crying children on the wind. The legacy of the Sullivan case is complex and enduring. It became a powerful rhetorical tool for abolitionists, who used it to argue that the moral corruption of slavery extended beyond race, creating a system where absolute power could lead to absolute depravity. For the emerging field of child welfare, it was a horrific but catalytic event that helped spur the creation of the first laws against child cruelty and the establishment of more specialized institutions for the care of vulnerable children. The 47 children of Willow Creek disappeared from public history, their individual stories fading into the past. But their collective experience stands as a permanent testament to human cruelty and resilience. They were victims of a darkness that festered not in a slum or a frontier, but in the heart of a respected, civilized society. Their story is a chilling reminder that the most terrifying monsters are not those that hide in the shadows, but those that greet us politely in the light of day. The mystery of the Sullivan basement is a wound on the American soul. But history is filled with such dark corners, each with a story that demands to be told. If you are compelled by the unresolved, by the echoes of tragedies that shaped our world, then your search for understanding continues with us. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. We are dedicated to uncovering the truths that lie buried in the past.
Even with the perpetrators punished and the victims given sanctuary, the Sullivan case leaves behind a haunting trail of unanswered questions and philosophical dilemmas that echo into the present day. The sheer logistical and psychological mechanics of maintaining such a secret for 30 years boggle the mind and invite a deeper analysis of the societal structures that allowed it to happen. How did the secret remain intact for so long? The complicity of the enslaved population was secured through terror, but the silence of the wider white community is more telling. It speaks to a culture of willful blindness and an unwavering deference to class and reputation. The Sullivans' social standing was a shield that actively discouraged scrutiny. Neighbors, merchants, and even local officials accepted flimsy explanations because the alternative, believing that a deacon and a lady were monstrous child torturers, was too cognitively dissonant to entertain. The case is a stark lesson in how privilege can create a bubble of impunity, and how a community's desire for order can become a weapon for evil. What was the ultimate psychological motivation of Alistair and Beatrice Sullivan? While the desire to hide imperfect children is recognized if abhorrent historical phenomenon, the scale and duration of the Sullivan operation suggest a pathology far deeper than vanity. Some historians have speculated that Alistair Sullivan may have suffered from a severe obsessive-compulsive disorder focused on the perception of purity and order, which has deformed children violently offended. Beatrice's role is even more enigmatic. Was she a coerced victim, broken by years of childbirth and subjugation to her husband's will? Or was she an active, willing participant in the horror, sharing his obsession with maintaining a perfect facade? Their silence at the trial and afterwards robbed history of any definitive answer, leaving their motives shrouded in nightmare. The legal and ethical implications of the case were profound. The Sullivan trial helped establish the precedent that parents did not have an absolute, property-like right over their children. It was a crucial early step in the long journey toward the concept of children's rights. Furthermore, the use of testimony from enslaved people against white defendants was highly unusual and controversial for the time. Their credible, damning words were a crack in the legal foundation of a system that largely considered them unreliable narrators of their own lives. In a small way, the trial exposed the absurdity of that prejudice. The fate of the children at Hope Haven raises enduring questions about trauma and recovery. The Quakers of 1835 were operating with no modern understanding of neuroscience or psychology. Their methods were based on kindness, patience, and faith. How many of the children could have been helped with modern therapeutic interventions? Their story remains a poignant reminder of the long-term intergenerational impact of severe childhood trauma and the resilience of the human spirit, even in the face of unimaginable attempts to extinguish it. The cellar at Willow Creek is gone, plowed under by a state eager to forget. The Sullivans died in prison, unmourned. The 47 children have long since passed away. But the story endures because it is not just a history, it is a warning. It is a lesson in the dangers of unchecked authority, the poison of social stigma, and the violence that can be inflicted in the name of preserving appearances. It reminds us that civilization is a thin veneer, and that the duty to look closer, to ask uncomfortable questions, and to speak for those who have been silenced is a price we must always be willing to pay to prevent the darkness from winning. The echoes of the past are never silent. They whisper to us in the stories we uncover and the mysteries we strive to solve. The channel is dedicated to listening to those echoes and bringing them to light. If you believe that understanding history is key to navigating the present, then join us on this journey. Subscribe and hit the bell. Our exploration of the world's deepest mysteries is only just beginning.